Perth, Western Australia. Summer 1996. A city that called itself the world's most isolated capital, shining white and quiet by the Indian Ocean. The air carried salt, eucalyptus, and the confidence of a place untouched by the darker headlines of bigger cities. On Friday nights, young professionals and students filled the bars along Bayview Terrace in Claremont. Stylish, safe, predictable. People left car doors unlocked. Women walked home in heels after midnight without a second thought. Then one of them didn't make it home. Her name was Sarah Spiers. 18, newly working as a receptionist. She called a taxi from a public phone at 2:06 a.m. on January 27th. The driver arrived minutes later. She wasn't there. The booth stood empty, the line still humming. No one saw a struggle, no scream carried through the humid air. She had simply evaporated between the bright lights of the Continental Hotel and the still suburbs beyond. The taxi company logged her request. Police checked it by morning. Her family waited, then panicked. By the end of the weekend, Perth's easy self-assurance had begun to fracture. Detectives started with the familiar ritual friends, boyfriends, movements. Sarah's social circle was ordinary. There was no reason to vanish voluntarily. Without CCTV or smartphones, the night left almost nothing behind. Flyers went up. Her parents appeared on television, their voices steady, pleading. The police commander promised answers. Weeks passed, none came. And just as the city began to settle back into denial, another young woman disappeared. Jane Rimmer, 23, bright, social, and grounded, spent the night of June 8, 1996 at the Continental Hotel, the same Claremont strip, the same carefree atmosphere. Friends watched her step outside just after midnight to wait for a ride. When they looked again, she was gone. 2 months later, a bushwalker found her body in scrubland south of Perth. The news cracked the illusion of coincidence. 2 women, same district, same hour, same quiet removal. Perth, population 1 million, had a serial killer. The investigation expanded overnight. It would become the largest in Western Australia's history, a multi-agency task force named Macro. More than 100 officers, new forensic labs, helicopters, psychological profilers. They logged every taxi in the metro area, fingerprinted hundreds of men, re-interviewed everyone who had been out in Claremont that summer. The task force mapped the city like a nervous system of fear. Yet the predator moved unseen. For a year nothing happened. Then, on March 14, 1997, Ciara Glennon, 27, left a friend's birthday celebration at the Continental and walked toward Stirling Highway to find a cab. She had just returned from Ireland, a corporate lawyer with family waiting at home. When she failed to arrive, her friends reported her missing within hours. The city already knew what that meant. 3 weeks later, her body was discovered in Eglinton bushland north of Perth. Same disposal pattern, same violence. 3 women, 3 families, 1 invisible hunter. Fear rewrote the geography of nightlife. Women stopped walking alone. Parents kept daughters home. Cab fares doubled. For detectives, every lead turned circular. They interviewed hundreds of taxi drivers, nightclub staff, security guards, mechanics. They examined tire tracks, hair samples, fibers. Nothing tied to a suspect. Every Monday, newspapers printed maps dotted with theories. The Macro Task Force filled warehouses with paperwork, and the killer seemed to vanish back into the suburbs. Years passed. The case grew cold but never closed. Detectives retired. New ones inherited the boxes. DNA science moved faster than they could read reports. By 2008, Western Australia's forensic labs could extract full profiles from microscopic traces. They reopened evidence sealed for a decade. Fingernail scrapings from Ciara Glennon's hands, tiny fibers from Jane Rimmer's hair. Under the microscope, technology revealed what human eyes had missed: mixed DNA. Partial male profiles waiting for a database to match them. In 2016, 19 years after the last murder, the match arrived. A sample from a discarded Sprite bottle and a tissue found in a Telstra work vehicle linked to a technician named Bradley Robert Edwards produced the same profile as the unknown Claremont killer. Quiet, divorced, father of 2, he had once volunteered at a community theater, a man no one would have feared. But his police record contained an older entry: an assault on a social worker in 1990. His DNA from that case, stored and later digitized, closed the circle. After 2 decades of silence, the Macro Task Force had a name. Edwards' arrest on December 22, 2016 shocked Perth again, but this time with grim relief. The evidence trail was painstaking. Telstra fibers identical to those found on the victims. Minute DNA fragments under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. Phone tower data showing Edwards's work routes passing through Claremont on the nights of the disappearances. He was charged with the murders of Rimmer and Glennon, and the suspected abduction of Sarah Spiers, whose body has never been found. The trial began in 2019, before a judge alone no jury, by Edwards's choice. It lasted 7 months, a slow dissection of evidence built molecule by molecule. Prosecutors outlined how the Telstra uniforms, the car fibers, the cell data converged. Defense counsel argued contamination, coincidence, misunderstanding. But the DNA told its own story. In September 2020, the court found Bradley Robert Edwards guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. The judge called the evidence compelling beyond reasonable doubt. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 40 years, effectively until death. He was acquitted of Sarah Spiers' murder for lack of direct proof, but the court said it was likely he was responsible. Her family accepted the verdict through tears, still without a grave to visit. Even after conviction, the echoes of the Claremont killings reached beyond Australia. Investigators from the US and Europe studied the case for its forensic milestones: the use of cold-stored DNA, the microscopic fiber matching, the digital mapping of a decades-old hunt. It became a blueprint for long-term serial offender detection in modern policing. For Perth, the legacy is personal. The Claremont nightlife never fully recovered its innocence. Every cab rank, every late-night walk, carries memory of the years when a city thought it was safe and learned it wasn't. The case reminds investigators that persistence, sometimes measured in decades, can still break silence. The arrests had made headlines, but the story of how the net finally tightened was longer, stranger, and full of near misses. For almost 20 years, the Macro Task Force had lived in two worlds, half routine, half obsession. Dozens of detectives cycled through the unit, each inheriting thousands of pages of notes from the one before. Some retired, convinced the killer would never be caught. Others stayed because they couldn't walk away. Perth's newspapers marked every anniversary with the same photographs: Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon, three faces frozen in their early 20s, three reminders that the city's calm surface hid unfinished business. In the late 1990s, Macro's command base filled an entire floor of police headquarters. Computer banks, wall-sized maps, boxes stacked to the ceiling. Detectives logged every call that came in, truck drivers convinced they'd seen something, psychics claiming visions, women sure they'd been followed by a white sedan. Each tip took hours to verify and almost always collapsed into nothing. The frustration was constant. One senior officer described the case as a black hole that swallows careers. Yet small fragments of truth were being collected even then. Crime scene technicians had taken samples from under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. The material was minimal, almost invisible, stored in sealed envelopes at a time when DNA testing could barely handle complex mixtures. It sat in storage for years, labeled and forgotten. In 2001, new technology allowed the first re-extraction. Analysts obtained a faint partial profile mail, but incomplete. They called it the unknown contributor. It was the first sign of the man who had haunted Perth's western suburbs. The problem was database scale. Australia's national DNA index was still limited, and Western Australia's sample pool was small. Without a reference point, the fragment floated like a fingerprint in a vacuum. Detectives hoped the killer would reoffend and be caught for something else, but no matching crimes appeared. The Claremont killings stopped after 1997. It was as if the predator had turned invisible or gone to ground forever. By 2004, public pressure forced a complete review. A new generation of detectives reopened every witness statement, re-examined every photograph, and requested fresh forensic testing. They rebuilt the timelines from scratch. Each victim had left the Continental Hotel area after midnight, walked a short distance toward Stirling Highway, and vanished within minutes. None of their friends saw them get into a car. Taxi drivers on duty that night were questioned repeatedly. Investigators began to suspect that the killer might not be a stranger to the area but someone whose presence there seemed normal, possibly a worker, a tradesman, a driver wearing a uniform that made people feel safe. That theory stayed on the whiteboard for years without a name beside it. Then came the quiet breakthrough. In 2008, cold case scientists revisited the stored samples from Ciara Glennon and Jane Rimmer using advanced mitochondrial DNA sequencing. The new results produced full profiles for both women and the same partial male sequence recovered from Ciara's fingernails. The match linked the two murders definitively to one offender. It was the forensic bridge investigators had needed for a decade. They could now prove the same man had killed both women. The next question was identity. In 2013, Western Australia expanded its DNA database, uploading thousands of old case samples. Among them was genetic material from a 1990 sexual assault at Karrakatta Cemetery, a lone attack on a teenage social worker who had been dragged off a path at night, gagged, and raped, but survived. The offender had never been caught, yet the DNA from that case remained intact. When analysts ran the new comparisons, alarms triggered across the system. The profile from the Karrakatta rape matched the male DNA under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. After 16 years of silence, the Claremont killer had just reintroduced himself. Detectives knew that whoever had committed that assault in 1990 would be traceable. It predated the murders by 6 years and might have left fingerprints or employment records. The rape had occurred near Hollywood Hospitalland area frequented by contractors from local utility companies. Among those companies was Telstra, Australia's national telephone provider, whose technicians drove white company vehicles throughout Perth's suburbs. One name from the original Karrakatta file drew attention. A technician questioned and released. After a minor incident at a social service building that same year, Bradley Robert Edwards. He'd been charged with assaulting a social worker by grabbing her from behind in an office corridor, an event he later described as a moment of stress. He pleaded guilty, received a small fine, and kept his job. Police back then had treated it as isolated misbehavior, not the prelude to serial murder. When the old record surfaced, detectives ordered a covert surveillance operation. By 2016, Edwards was 48, remarried, living quietly in Kewdale, still employed by Telstra. Undercover officers followed him for weeks. They collected discarded items, drink bottles, tissues from public bins near his car. Forensic testing confirmed what the cold case unit had feared and hoped for. His DNA matched the unknown contributor from the Claremont murders and the Karrakatta rape. The chain was complete. December 22, 2016. A dozen detectives surrounded his suburban house just after 7 in the morning. Edwards answered the door wearing shorts and a polo shirt, bewildered but calm. He was arrested without resistance. Inside the home, investigators found Telstra work uniforms, cable ties, electrical tape, and a faded Holden Commodore sedan similar to witness descriptions from the 1990s. They also found pornographic material depicting abduction fantasies. For the macro veterans, it was the culmination of a hunt that had defined half their careers. The arrest exploded across Australian media. After 2 decades of speculation, the face of the Claremont killer was suddenly on every front page. But investigators knew that an arrest was only half the battle. The prosecution would need to survive years of scrutiny. They spent another 3 years assembling the evidence, thousands of pages of forensic reports, fiber matching analyses that linked microscopic Telstra-issued fibers to those found on the victim's clothing, and digital mapping that traced Edwards's work routes past Claremont on the nights the women vanished. When the trial opened in November 2019, there was no jury by Edwards's own request. The courtroom became a laboratory of patience. Prosecutors walked the judge through every strand of fiber, every timeline, every DNA chart. Witnesses described seeing a Telstra vehicle cruising the area in the 1990s. Former colleagues recounted his temper, his secretive habits, his obsession with late-night drives. The defense argued contamination, that the evidence was decades old, that laboratory processes could have introduced Edwards's DNA accidentally. But the pattern was too consistent, the probabilities too tight. Each day in court revisited another year of fear for the families. Sarah Spiers' parents attended even though her case was not part of the formal murder charges. They sat behind the prosecution bench, silent reminders of the missing. When forensic specialists described the moment the DNA profile matched, the room stayed still except for the scratch of pens. No one looked at Edwards. He sat expressionless, hands folded, the image of ordinariness. That blankness frightened observers more than any display of guilt might have. After 7 months of evidence and argument, the verdict arrived on September 24, 2020. The judge read for hours reasoning, probabilities, fiber tables. Finally, the words that Perth had waited 23 years to hear: guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, guilty of the 1995 Karrakatta rape, guilty of abduction and assault. Not guilty of Sarah Spiers' murder due to insufficient direct evidence, but almost certainly responsible. The sentence, life imprisonment, minimum 40 years. A courtroom designed for calm could not contain the release of emotion that followed. Families embraced, officers wept openly. Edwards stared straight ahead, unflinching. Outside, television crews broadcast live as the state's police commissioner spoke the simplest possible summary. This is justice long delayed, but not denied. The line became headline copy around the world. In the United States, law enforcement journals highlighted the case for its forensic persistence, the ability of cold-stored DNA to survive decades and still convict. Investigators from California's Golden State Killer Task Force exchanged data with their Australian counterparts, comparing methods that had independently cracked two of the longest unsolved serial cases on opposite sides of the planet. Back in Perth, the effect was quieter. Claremont's bar district thrived again, but its streetlights seemed brighter, its cameras more numerous. Young patrons who hadn't been born when Sarah Spiers disappeared learned her name from memorial plaques near the taxi ranks. The Macro Task Force office closed at last, its case boards archived in police storage. Officers who had spent half their careers chasing a shadow finally turned in their badges or transferred to calmer work. One veteran said the sound of the phone at 2 a.m. would always make him flinch. That was when most leads had come in, and most hopes had died. Edwards never spoke publicly. Through lawyers he maintained that the DNA was planted, that he had nothing to do with the murders. Appeals followed, but none altered the judgment. The forensic chain was airtight, the mathematics unyielding. The killer, who had hidden in plain sight as a technician, trusted to repair phones. When the courtroom emptied and the television crews packed their cables, Western Australia faced the long shadow of what had been uncovered. The Claremont investigation had consumed nearly a quarter century, a generation of detectives, and more than $40 million in state funding. Yet the number that mattered most wasn't in the budgets. It was the years stolen from 3 young women and the decades their families had waited for a name. Inside police headquarters, the Macro Task Force wound down for the last time. Officers boxed evidence, labeled binders, and removed the maps that had once charted every lead across the city. In their place they left a timeline, 1996 to 2020, 24 years of pursuit. Some of the team had joined as rookies and retired as veterans before the verdict arrived. The closure was bittersweet, satisfaction laced with fatigue. They'd caught the killer, but no victory could return the missing. Public reaction in Perth shifted from relief to introspection. For years the case had divided the city, half convinced police were out of their depth, half still hopeful. Now there was only the aftermath. Newspapers ran retrospectives with the same question: how had a man so ordinary lived among them unnoticed? Neighbors remembered him mowing lawns, walking his dog, speaking politely at the mailbox. Co-workers recalled a quiet technician who fixed computers and avoided small talk. The ordinariness itself became the most unsettling detail. While Edwards settled into the isolation of a high-security unit at Casuarina prison, forensic teams finalized their reports for archiving. They described how a single DNA molecule had survived 23 years sealed in an envelope and still told the truth. Scientists called it a triumph of evidence preservation. Detectives called it luck tempered by obsession. Either way, it rewrote investigative textbooks around the world. Agencies from the United States, Canada, and Europe requested briefings on the Claremont methodology, how cold-stored samples, microfibers, and exhaustive digital mapping could converge to expose a serial killer long after the crimes. The psychological toll lingered longer. For families, closure was not peace. The Spiers family, still without Sarah's body, continued to search privately through bushland with volunteers. Each discovery of bone fragments or clothing anywhere near Perth triggered fresh testing, always ending the same way: negative. Jane Rimmer's relatives worked with victim advocacy groups, turning grief into prevention campaigns. Ciara Glennon's parents funded scholarships for young lawyers in her name. The names of their daughters, once attached to fear, began to symbolize endurance. In 2021, the state government commissioned a public review of the macro investigation. It found missteps typical of long cases: data overload, tunnel vision, the failure to share early DNA results nationally. Yet it also praised the persistence that had kept the file alive through political cycles and budget cuts. The report concluded that the decisive factor was not technology alone but human tenacity. That phrase appeared on plaques later installed at police headquarters. Tenacity breaks silence. the media's attention turned toward understanding the man himself. Background profiles traced Edwards's life from childhood in suburban Perth to his work as a Telstra technician. Nothing explained the leap from quiet adolescence to predation. Experts described him as the archetype of the organized offender, methodical, detached, able to mimic normality while harboring violent impulses. He had used his work uniform and company car as camouflage, moving freely in places where strangers were trusted. Every detail of his crimes, the timing, the selection of victims, the disposal sites, suggested planning measured in minutes and miles. That precision had fooled investigators for years. Meanwhile, public fascination with forensic science surged. True crime podcasts dissected the case episode by episode. University courses used it as a model for modern cold case work. The U.S. connection deepened when analysts compared Claremont's DNA breakthroughs to the techniques that solved the Golden State Killer case. Different continents, same patients, same result. Both had proven that evidence can outlive denial. But beneath the academic interest lay a quieter reckoning. For 2 decades, the Claremont killings had changed how Perth lived. Women planned nights out with exit strategies. Parents installed extra locks. Taxi demand spiked. Fear became a habit. The verdict closed the case legally but couldn't erase the culture of vigilance it had created. Even in 2024, when younger crowds filled the revitalized bars, older residents still glanced over shoulders on their way to parked cars. The city remembered. Edwards rarely left his cell. Reports from prison staff described a man withdrawn, reading constantly, speaking little. He showed no remorse, no outburst, just the slow erosion of time. Appeals filed on technical grounds failed. In interviews years later, detectives said they never expected confession. He's built on denial, one explained, and that's all he's got left. Outside, the story continued to evolve. In 2022, filmmakers and journalists revisited the investigation, turning thousands of hours of footage and transcripts into documentaries that reached global audiences. Yet the tone remained restrained. Producers avoided dramatization, letting the facts carry their own tension. The lesson was clear. The real terror came not from embellishment but from the ordinariness of evil. By 2023, the Police Evidence Archive opened selected materials to the public: photographs of fiber analyses, timelines, and excerpts from detective diaries. Visitors to the small museum exhibit in Perth saw how many years separated each tiny discovery, how patient science had to be before truth finally caught up. It became less a story about horror and more about endurance. The families of the victims attended the exhibit's opening. They stood quietly beside the display of their daughters' names etched into glass. There were no speeches, only a single sentence printed on the wall: they were loved. They were missed. They are remembered. The simplicity of it held more power than any documentary could. As 2024 drew to a close, the Claremont case officially shifted from active file to closed archive. Detectives moved on, students studied the investigation as history, and a city once defined by fear began to reclaim its nights. The serial killer had been found, tried, and buried alive in his sentence. But the echo of those 3 names, Sarah, Jane, Ciara, remained part of Western Australia's conscience. They were reminders that even in places that believe they're safe, vigilance and empathy must walk hand in hand. The Claremont serial killings will always be Australia's longest chase for a single murderer. It proved that truth can take decades but still arrive. It also showed that the smallest trace of fiber, a speck of blood, a single cell can hold a lifetime of justice waiting to be heard. The trial's final papers closed one story and opened another. In Western Australia, lawmakers cited the Claremont investigation whenever they spoke about cold case funding, DNA databases, and the duty to believe victims who sense danger before anyone else does. The files that once filled the macro task force offices now live in climate-controlled storage, a library of lessons written in blood and patience. Forensic scientists still talk about the case as the moment the future arrived. A handful of cells beneath Ciara Glennon's fingernails survived decades, then became proof beyond doubt. The laboratory that handled those samples went on to train technicians from the United States and Europe. Their message was simple: evidence doesn't die if you preserve it, and people refused to quit looking. Victim advocacy groups used the Claremont story to push for change. Domestic violence reporting lines expanded. Missing person protocols were rewritten so that a call like Sarah Spiers' disappearance now triggers major case attention within hours, not days. The police culture that once doubted urgency began to understand it. In that sense, the women whose names filled headlines in the 90s changed the system that failed them. For the families, The decades since the verdict have been quieter but never easy. The Spiers family still keeps a private fund for search efforts in the bushlands north of Perth. The Rimmers and Glennons maintain scholarships and community projects in memory of their daughters. They rarely speak to media now. The silence is its own memorial. Bradley Robert Edwards remains at Casuarina Prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2060, when he would be more than 100 years old. The sentence ensures that he will die behind walls. He does not speak publicly, and the state has no interest in hearing from him. The story no longer belongs to the killer, it belongs to the people who refuse to forget. Outside the prison, life in Perth has resumed its rhythm. Bayview Terrace glows again on weekend nights, taxis line up, music spills from open doors. But near the taxi ranks small brass plaques carry 3 names and 3 years, 1996, 1996, 1997. They are reminders that safety is never inherited. It's built, guarded, and learned. When journalists describe the Claremont killings now, they speak less about horror and more about endurance, the patience of detectives, the precision of scientists, the strength of families who waited half a lifetime for justice. The case has become a national benchmark, proof that time can be and a lie if truth is kept alive long enough to meet it. The murders of Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, and Ciara Glennon reshaped an entire country's idea of investigation. They taught Western Australia that even in a city built on sunshine and distance, darkness can live next door. And they taught the world that persistence, not genius, is what finally brings the missing home.